no one ever forgot the first night the lights came on in Pandemonium City. They blazed white as cut bone along every avenue, through every tower window, even beneath the glassy waters of the canal loops. The mayor declared the dawn of everlasting illumination, but the citizens soon learned the price of it. Every lumen was fed by their own terror. Great turbines beneath the streets spun on the raw acoustics of agony, and those acoustics were harvested in the vast, purpose-built horror arenas ringing the metropolis like iron thorns. People were marched in by the thousands to face mechanical nightmares, gene-spliced predators, and psychoactive hallucinations so vivid they left claw marks on the mind. Their shrieks rose to the vaulted sound collectors, where crystalline diaphragms translated fear into current, and the city thrummed with stolen electricity. Inside that clamor lived a single pocket of quiet. Leora, the girl who had no voice. She had lost it in Arena 12 on the winter solstice. The spectacle that evening had been titled the Maw of Mirrors. Spectators were forced across a floor of reflective obsidian, while holographic versions of themselves were flayed by invisible blades. The audience screamed, and the screams were swallowed by thirsty microphones. Leora felt her own terror rising until something inside her snapped, not from fear, but defiance. Her mouth opened, and instead of sound, nothing emerged. It was as though her vocal cords had cauterized themselves. The attendants, expecting another decibel to tally, yanked her aside, examined her throat, found no wound, and pronounced her useless to the grid. They threw her into the angular alleyways at the city's edge, where dim lamps flickered on the drips of second-hand screams. In that fading glow, Leora discovered what silence could accomplish. A single failed scream had darkened a stretch of street long enough for her to escape notice. A thought bloomed. Quiet was not merely absence, it was sabotage. If hunger for noise powered pandemonium, then hush could starve it. For months she wandered the underlevels, mapping conduits, sneaking into maintenance vaults, learning the arterial routes by which recorded shrieks were pumped to the central transduction spire. She watched indicators dip whenever a performer missed a note of horror, saw streetlights shiver when babies fell asleep mid-cry. Tiny vacancies, but proof of concept. Yet one mute throat was a raindrop against a furnace. She needed an army of stillness. She began with the broken. Arena survivors spilled out nightly, limping, bleeding, eyes vibrating from drug-induced visions. When they retched behind dumpsters, she slipped out of the shadows with a scrap of chalk and wrote on walls, "You can choose quiet." Most assumed it a spiritual bromide and staggered on, but a handful stopped. To those few she offered bread, water, and a lesson. She taught them to breathe without sound, to swallow the impulse to vocalize pain. She shaped hand signals for courage, patience, retreat. They learned to perform agony without noise body convulsing, eyes wide mouth open, yet the air unmoved. Watching them master the art, Leora felt like a conductor of a silent orchestra. Word of mouth ironically mute spread. People left chalk marks of concentric circles on drain pipes, indicating safe meeting grottos where Leora lectured by candle flicker. She named the movement the Hush. Membership swelled to dozens, then scores, while the Department of Vociferation remained oblivious, too busy calibrating shriek meters for the next festival. Silence, after all, made no measurable headline. Not until the night of the resonant eclipse. The resonant eclipse was Pandemonium's annual energy binge. City authorities synchronized every arena to climax simultaneously at midnight, when the moon slid across the sun and psychological unease would already prickle the populace. The grid would feast on a continent's worth of sonic trauma in 6 minutes. Officials anticipated record lumens, record profits, record compliance. Leora saw an opening large enough to step through history. Her plan hinged on 2 simple acts: infiltration and instruction. First, smuggle hush operatives into each arena disguised as attendants. Second, trigger a mass demonstration of silence at the precise instant the collectors opened. With the diaphragms exposed but no screams delivered, feedback would rebound through the empty circuits, overloading the crystal matrices. The resulting power void could cascade, snapping junction after junction, a blackout wide enough to birth a revolution. Junction wished may got wide enough to birth a Revolt. Pulling it off required choreography at the scale of apocalypse. The week before the eclipse, Leora and her captains moved like ghosts through sewage arteries, popping up in supply depots to swap out rosters. They bribed janitors for uniform tags, replaced amplifiers with look-alike duds, sectioned with knife-nicked wires, planted EMP grenades inside maintenance toolkits. All executed beneath the decoy of normal civic dread. Meanwhile, the arena's stages were erected with ever greater monstrosities. A centrifuge of bone saws, a tank of shape-shifting eels, a maze laced with recombinant pheromones that made the victim's own heartbeat sound like a predator's growl. Stadium announcers rehearsed their blood-soaked narrations and ticket prices soared. In their boardrooms, energy-directed executives toasted the coming harvest with champagne that fizzed like severed larynxes. On the eve of cataclysm, Leora stood atop an abandoned signal tower overlooking the glittering rings of arena domes. Around her, the hush assembled in graded tiers of rooftop and gangway. She raised her hands, the only flag the movement had, and signed the pledge each of them knew by heart. Signs slow and emphatic. Our silence is not consent. It is a blade. They responded in kind. Quiet will cut. Below, the city throbbed like a monstrous heart longing for a scream. The eclipse day dawned a bruised purple, sky smeared with unnatural haze from the directorate's celebratory fireworks. Crowds funneled through barricades while drone speakers looped slogans. Your fear lights the future. Everyone understood attendance was mandatory. The penalty for skipping was seizure of rations, eviction, or worse, an unscheduled solo session inside the arena, no witnesses. So citizens marched dutifully, many already hoarse at the memory of what awaited. Inside Arena 12, where Leora had lost her voice, the central pit sprouted chrome crucifixes wired with biosensors. The show was titled Threnody of Tendons. As technicians finalized calibrations, Leora slipped among them, ID badge forged, a silent clipboard in hand. No one noticed her quiet. Engineers often communicated by gesture during delicate sound tests. She placed herself near the primary collector, a domed lattice of quartz prongs pointing downward like inverted stalactites. Outside the arena, a slight lattice of quartz prongs pointing downward like inverted stalactites. The quartz would be the first to overload. 11 stories up, in the announcer's booth, stood Warden Corvin, chief auditor of Screams. He wore headphones that piped test howls directly into his eardrums, a grin sharp as static. Corvin had once been a street preacher, selling salvation through vocal catharsis. Now he sold the grid. He scanned attendance graphs, scrolling across holo screens. Numbers perfect. Tonight would mint his promotion to Arch-Helmsman of Power. He raised a tumbler of amber to the descending sun. Below, Leora felt more arrivals than she saw, the tremor of 10,000 footsteps, a pressure that buffeted her eardrums even without noise. She glanced at her counterfeit chronometer, 13 minutes to totality. Around the arena rim, she picked out hush agents wearing the tiny emblem of inked spiral on their wrists. They caught her look, flexed silent thumbs. T-minutes, 9 minutes seating locked. Auto barriers ratcheted closed. The audience's collective breath echoed like wind through a grave hollow. Ushers distributed bite rods so screams would not shred tongues too early, a courtesy disguised as cruelty. Leora saw recipients glance at the rods, perplexed, then found them chewing absent-mindedly. She recognized several of her recruits. They mouthed no words, only met her gaze and nodded. Good. They were ready. Team is 5 minutes. Corvin's amplified voice boomed. Citizens of Pandemonium, your voices fuel tomorrow. The crowd erupted, but the first deviation surfaced instantly. From Section D12 rose not screams, but a rippling hush, a wave of sealed lips amid the roars. It spread like ice across a pond, shouted threats, but intimidation that relied on promised pain required the victim's scream to have teeth. Strip the sound and the fear grew toothless. Corvin frowned, turning dials. Feedback squealed overhead. He pinged technicians. Meter variance reading? Numbers glitched. Leora muted her console feed, pretending to troubleshoot. Inside her chest, her heartbeat hammered Morse. Steady, steady, steady. 2 minutes, other arenas reported anomaly. Arena 8 registered decibel drops. Arena 4 detected inverse spikes, collectors trembling with resonance sans input, a vacuum thirsting for noise. Directorate comm channels erupted in frantic chatter. Corvan barked. Open the spill valve, siphon reserve, terror reserves to stabilize. Somewhere downtown, storage vaults of pre-recorded execution shrieks unspooled into the grid, but the energy refused translation. Without live counterpart frequencies to couple to, the system stuttered. Damage. 30 seconds, the eclipse began. Daylight shrank to a serrated sliver, bathing everything in bruise-colored penumbra. This was the fuse Leora had waited months to strike. She lowered her clipboard, met the eyes of a child in row 30, raised 2 fingers. The final signal. 0. A concert of silence detonated. Every Hush member, whether disguised attendant, prisoner, or concession vendor, opened their mouths in a perfect illusion of horror and delivered nothing. Adjacent citizens, conditioned to mimic, fell quiet in confusion. Some managed a startled yelp, but the reservoirs of Hush swallowed them. Within seconds, quiet blanketed the stadium, a silence so loud it churned the stomach. The collectors, expecting a sonic deluge, encountered a vacuum instead. Quartz prongs vibrated at sympathetic frequencies. Harmonics overlapped, and the domed lattice fractured in a spiderweb of hairline light. In the control booth, Corvan's monitors bled red error glyphs. He slammed fists on the console. Pump gain to maximum, force induction. Technicians obeyed. Dials spun. Servo arms rotated. Diaphragms wider. The machine inhaled for a scream that did not arrive. Pressure built, reversed, imploded. A bluish corona washed across circuitry, and the main breaker blew with the sound of 1,000 glass organs shattering. Lights died. The blackout leapt from Arena 12 to the city core in under 3 seconds. Substations went blind. Carnival rides stuttered to stillness mid-loop. Hospitals fell to emergency batteries. Skyscraper billboards blinked off, unveiling the stars for the first time in decades. Silence spread faster than any shout. Within the chaos, disciplines long rehearsed surfaced. Hush operatives guided civilians via hand gestures toward emergency exits, pried open servo locks with hydraulic jaws, shepherded masses through smoke that smelled of burnt quartz. Outside, alleys previously patrolled by drone sentries now lay powerless, propellers stilled. Citizens, realizing the watchdogs were deaf and blind, broke into cheers, but stopped themselves, half laughing, half horrified at their reflex. Some clapped hands to mouths as if the air itself had become precious. Leora exited through a maintenance hatch onto the stadium roof. The eclipse's dark disk still choked the sky. Down avenues, she saw other arenas emitting plumes of indigo flame as collectors ruptured. She felt no triumph, yet victories make noise, and noise fed the enemy even in death. She signed to a relay runner. Phase 2. Across rooftops, teams unspooled fiber cables patched into homemade inverters. They tapped dormant solar arrays, still warm from before the eclipse, channeling microcharges into localized grids, enough to power clinics, water pumps, radio beacons. In the vacuum left by shriek energy, the city discovered lesser but gentler lights. But tyranny, like electricity, seeks a path to ground. Corvan staggered from the smoking booth, faced the vacuity tide, and roared, "You will pay this with your lives, your city will starve." His voice, enormous even without amplification, carried over the hum of distant fires. Some civilians flinched, conditioned. Leora watched him stride atop a railing, bullhorn in fist, primal authority radiating. If the people answered him in fear now, if even a single mass scream rose, the remaining collectors might scavenge enough current to reboot security turrets. She descended a ladder, threading through panicked crowds until she stood 10 paces from the warden. He saw her, recognized her. The voiceless malfunction from months ago. Triumph twisted his lips. He aimed the bullhorn and shouted, "This girl would steal your light. Shall we let her?" The crowd murmured, trembled. Leora's absence of voice suddenly felt like a canyon inside her. She placed fingers to throat, willing sound that would never come. Behind her, flames crackled. Above, eclipse totality began to wane, sunlight edging black. If Corvan kept speaking, his words could marshal enough terror to reignite the grid. She reached into her pocket and removed a shard of broken quartz. Light from the fires refracted inside it. She raised it high. Then, in one fluid motion, she crushed the shard in her palm. Blood beaded between fingers. The watching masses inhaled as a single organism. Leora lifted the bloodied hand to her lips and drew a line across them, red and vivid. Slowly she extended that hand toward the crowd and folded it into the hushed salute. 2 fingers touched a sealed mouth, then fanned outward like a closing wing. The gesture leapt person to person, silent as snowfall. Citizens mirrored her, fingers to lips, outward flourish. Entire stands became a forest of mute defiance. Corvan's bullhorn faltered mid-bellow. His drivers re-echoed only his own breathing. He shouted louder, veins bulging. The quiet swallowed him. When he hurled the bullhorn at Leora, she sidestepped, and the device clattered emptily. With no current, its feedback died before it began. 2 citizens seized the warden's arms, yanking him behind a barricade of overturned chairs. His howls receded into the hush, a moot spectacle now powering nothing at all. As sunlight clawed past the moon's rim, Pandemonium City remained dark, but not blind. In the unsettled half-light, people saw architecture beneath billboards, faces beneath fear. They heard wind between towers, water lapping canal steps, their own heartbeats. Some wept, but they did so in silence, tears shining where neon once glared. That night, Leora walked the central boulevard lined by dead lampposts. Members of the hush drifted beside her, their footfalls the loudest thing around. They reached the base of the transduction spire, which lay toppled, its skeletal frame crumpled like a discarded microphone stand. Here the city would either rebuild or cannibalize itself. Someone. A former arena janitor broke the quiet, voice small. What now? No power plants, no turbines, no grid? Leora couldn't answer with words. Instead, she knelt and pressed her ear to the pavement. Others copied her, curious. They heard a murmur deep, steady. The Earth's own resonance, unamplified, unexploited. She rose, brushed dust from her knees and gestured. We listen. Another woman signed back. And we speak. Leora shook her head gently. Not yet. First we learn what silence can build. In following weeks, neighborhoods erected hand-cranked generators, solar kites, and bioluminescent gardens. Children played the quiet game, their laughter trapped behind grinning teeth. Musicians composed symphonies performed entirely on skin drums and foot taps. A council of interpreters codified the hush signs into a civic language. They met in the husk of Arena 12, repurposing crucifixes into trellises for climbing vines. When arguments flared, they settled them with chalkboards instead of shouts. Leora became a myth, glimpsed more often than heard. A slim figure traversing rooftops, leaving bundles of blank parchment, an invitation to write rather than wail. Once, a little girl offered her a homemade whistle. She accepted, then tucked it away unused. Sound would come, but on people's own terms. The city needed to prove it could live without screams before relearning song. Yet some nights, wind in the vents still moaned like ghosts of the old grid, and young insurgents whispered of finishing the job, storming captivity archives, melting down arena gates, exiling every last engineer of torment. Leora understood the impulse, but vengeance was a loud instrument, and loudness had been weaponized before. Instead, she placed her palm on agitators' chests, feeling their thundering hearts, and reminded them through touch alone that quiet could be fiercer than any roar. Seasons turned. The arenas decayed into hanging gardens where silence and birdsong commingled. When the first newborn entered the world since the blackout, midwives waited breathless for its cry. But the infant emerged blinking, mouth parted in a wordless O, and regarded them calmly. The midwives glanced at each other. Should they pinch it, encourage lungs? They hesitated, uncertain. Then the baby drew in air and released a single, small laugh. Not a scream, not a protest, just the tentative music of a new beginning. Across the sleeping city, dim lanterns peeped like stars brought to earth by gentle hands. They ran on wind, sun, muscle, hope. None relied on terror, and while pandemonium still bore scars where microphones once hung, those wounds healed under layers of moss and mural and memory. One evening, long after headlines elsewhere called it the city of soft light, Leora stepped onto a balcony overlooking a square, where children chalk-painted silent symbols alongside pictures of the sun. She finally raised the whistle the little girl had given her, and pressed it to her lips. Breath wavered, hesitated. She lowered it again, smiled, and tucked it back. Some legacies were better unplayed. Instead, she cupped hands to mouth and exhaled a voiceless sigh that felt, at last, like peace.